folks, and welcome to The Farm, a podcast dedicated to culture, parapolitics, and high weirdness in all its many forms. This is your host, Recluse, aka Steven Snyder, the longtime curator of the Visor blog and author of A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment. If you like what you hear here today, be sure to check me out at visupview.blogspot.com. That's VISUPVIEW, all one word, .blogspot, also all one word.com. And procure a copy of that book among the works at The Farm's official store, which is at The Farm Podcast. That is The Farm Podcast, all one word, .store. And please consider signing up for The Farm's Patreon. At the lowest tier, you get 2 additional full-length shows per month. That's between 3 and 4 hours of bonus material with exclusive guests and content. And our all-access patrons have access to The Farm's monthly Zoom party meeting, my State of the Union addresses, periodic write-ups, dispatches from all the adventures I have, insights into the research that's ongoing over here, and all kinds of other goodies. It's a lot of material, guys, so definitely give that a consideration here. All right, today's guest is making his maiden appearance on The Farm. In fact, this is the first time he's really put any of his research out there, but it is freaking incredible, just absolutely off the chain. So on that note, I give you this independent, European-based avid podcast listener who goes by Senate. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, sir.
Hey, nice to be here.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, this show is very near and dear to me. This is a continuation of The Farm's Storied Wackle series, but with a twist. We're going to look at the evolution of the old Wackle network from the end of the Cold War up to current day events. And trust me, folks, it's simply incredible how relevant Wackle's legacy is in 2023. When Keith and I and the rest of the original Wackle crew began the podcast series, we saw this as largely a historical undertaking. But as the show we did on Abe's assassination this past summer revealed, the old Wackle network is still around and still a player, but with a new generation of individuals and groups and institutions that have taken up the work of the OGs. And at the forefront of this revival is another subject as relevant now as ever: private military and intelligence companies. One of the contentions that we shall make with this series is that modern-day PMCs and PICs have effectively taken up the role, by and large, of Wackle and like bodies from the Cold War era. Whereas during that period, Wackle served as a middle ground between Western elites from the conservative establishment and even in some cases the neoliberal order to, work things out with the motley crew of international drug and arms traffickers, aging Nazi war criminals, the next generation of black terrorists, and religious fanatics and cultists of all stripes. I mean, this was an incredible milieu, both sides of which largely still existing today. But increasingly, it's the private military and private intelligence companies where they're doing business with each other on any number of levels now. So this coincided with a profound transformation in organized crime post-Cold War. All across the world, but especially in Southern Africa and the Soviet Union, scores of highly trained ex-secret police, spies, and special operators were suddenly unemployed. Many drifted into organized crime before founding their own private security companies. This deeply changed the characteristic of organized crime, bringing in military-style hierarchy, training, and discipline into what had previously been primarily family affairs. And the results have been profound, to put it mildly. This is a major part of the Wackle PMC/PIC story. I've already dealt with the Southern African side in the Secret History of International Fascism series, a link of which I will provide in the description for that particular installment. I urge you guys to all check it out for some background. But that's not what we're concerned with today. At the center of it all was the most enigmatic of private military companies, one that I recently addressed in the Patreon section. It was an allegedly Russian-controlled PMC called Far West Limited. But it was so much more than that, as we shall see over the course of this series. Indeed, It may be the driving force behind the present war in Ukraine and how Joe Biden ended up in the White House. And seriously, I truly wish I was exaggerating with that claim. But as I think you guys will see over the course of this series, I don't think it's that far off the mark. So anyway, this show, as with all future Wacko-related content, is dedicated to the memory of the great Ed Kaufman, alias Don Diligent, an OG Wacko contributor who is dearly missed. For those of you unaware, Ed was the Mooney defector and the guy who provided us with so much incredible information on both the Unification Church and the OUNB, a subject that you'll be hearing a lot about over the course of this series. So hopefully I will be able to do something that will do Ed proud, because he strongly believed in the significance of the Ukrainian connection, as I have come to believe as well. So, Ed, this is for you. And on that note, let us start the show. Okay, the origins of Far West are rooted in a unique series of historical circumstances that unfolded during the 1970s. The 70s was not a great decade for the U.S. from a geopolitical standpoint. In 1971, Richard Nixon was forced to take the United States off the gold standard formally. This led to the first serious economic downturn the nation had experienced since World War II. The Watergate scandal emerged in 1974, followed by the unglamorous U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam during the following year. This basically marked the end of the U.S.'s toehold on the mainland of Eastern Asia outside of South Korea. We have been a staple on the mainland since the end of World War II. I mean, really just kind of think about it, the Pacific Theater, the Korean War, the Laos crisis, Vietnam, etc., etc. So this was no small turn of events after a quarter of a century of military intervention there. Finally, the decade ended with stagflation and the removal of the Shah, the good old Rock of Ages, from Iran. Up to this point in time, Iran had been our most important regional partner in the Middle East, as hard as that might be for some of our younger listeners to believe. To the outside world, and in more than a few U.S. foreign policy circles, this was seen as a disastrous reversal of fortunes for the American empire. Our economy appeared to be wavering domestically, while our legions were in retreat across the globe. It should have been exciting times for the Soviets. And to be sure, state media done much to advance Soviet prestige during the decade. But internally, things were falling apart. By the late 1970s, intelligence realists in the KGB understood that the USSR was effectively bankrupt, both politically and financially. Then head of the KGB and a sitting Politburo member called Vladimir Krychkov was especially adamant on these points. Krychkov was a protege of Yuri Andropov, former KGB head whom Krychkov had served under before taking over the dreaded spy agency. So by 1982, Andropov had become the chairman of the Politburo, effectively making him the ruler of the Soviet Union. Elsewhere, Krychkov was close to the top of the KGB. and this laid the stage for the floodgates of capitalism and crime to be unleashed upon the Soviet Union. Okay, so I'm going to quote here a little bit from an excellent book called Putin's People: How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West by a lady named Catherine Belton. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this work, but there is a certain bias to it, which you might get a chance to point out here in just a second. But anyway, going to take this here from pages 61 through 64 to give you guys a bit of a sense of what these folks were thinking. And this ties into eventually the wealth that was spirited out of the Soviet Union, which I'll get to here in just a second. So anyway, the story of the prosecutor's search for the missing party wealth was fast forgotten in the tumult of collapse. But what the prosecutors found then was a blueprint for everything that was to come later. The smuggling schemes and friendly firms and the trusted custodians became the model in which the Putin regime and its influence operations would run. The fact was that parts of the KGB foreign intelligence elite had begun preparing for a market transition ever since the former KGB chief, Yuri Andropov, became Soviet leader in 1982. In the early 80s, a handful of Soviet economists had begun to quietly discuss the need for a move to the market, whispering in the privacy of their kitchens about the chronic inefficiencies of the Soviet economy and publishing underground treatises on the need for reform. At the same time, there was a growing realization among the tight-knit group within the intelligence elite that the Soviet economy was in a death spiral, that it was impossible to maintain the empire of the Eastern Bloc, let alone run broader influence and disruption campaigns in South America, the Middle East, and Africa, and in the West. If you want to have a policy of being a great empire, you should be able to spend a huge amount of money, said one person who worked closely with reform-minded foreign intelligence chiefs in those days. It's not within our means to compete with the U.S. It was very costly and very difficult, impossible perhaps. Even before progressive elements within the KGB began tentatively preparing for a possible transition in East Germany, they've been pushing for sweeping reform in the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet economy was being drained of resources by the push to build up military production and compete with the West at the expense of everything else. The communist state was, in theory, succeeding in delivering its socialist vow of providing all workers with free education and health care. But in practice, the planned economy simply didn't work. Instead, there was a corrupted system under which the ordinary people the communist states were supposed to protect lived largely in poverty. The communist state could access plenty of natural resources for corrupt trading schemes, but it was failing to develop light industry to produce competitive consumer goods. There was no private ownership or even any understanding of what profit was. Indeed, the government handed down production quotas to each and every enterprise, controlled all earnings, and fixed prices for everything. There was no motivation for anyone, and the system just didn't work. Consumer good prices were fixed at incredibly low levels, but because of this, there was an acute shortage of everything. From bread, sausages, and other foodstuffs to cars, televisions, refrigerators, and even apartments. The shortages meant quotas and rationing, sometimes for months on end. Informal connections and payoffs to officials were often the only way to jump weeks-long queries for the most basic necessities, for shoe repairs, for hospital beds, for coffins, and funeral rites even. The overweening power of the Soviet bureaucracy had built corruption deep into the system, while under these conditions the black market flourished. In the late 60s, black marketeers, known as the Teshkakovi, began to set up underground factories in which spare parts and materials siphoned from the state-owned plants were used to produce goods outside the regulated economy. Such activities could result in jail sentences for 10 years or more, but increasingly, these factories' outputs was becoming the only way to make up for at least some of the shortages of the Soviet planned system. Hard currency speculators would trawl the halls of the Soviet in-tourist hotels, risking prison to buy dollars from visiting foreign tourists at an exchange rate far more advantageous to the tourist than the fixed Soviet one. It was a good deal for the speculators, too. In the system of Soviet shortages, anyone with access to hard currency was king. Dollars would gain you access to the well-stocked, cozy shops reserved for the Soviet elite, where the shelves were crammed with the quality foodstuffs and other luxuries of the West. It would enable you to buy Western clothing, Western pop music, and anything produced outside the stagnating and dreary Soviet economy, all of which could then be sold on for vast profits. The shortages in the Soviet economy ran so deep that, according to former KGB foreign intelligence operative Yuri Shevets, everyone was for sale. Factory directors fiddled the books to give materials to the black marketeers in return for a cut of the profits. Law enforcement officials turned a blind eye to the currency speculators marauding through Soviet hotels in return for bribes and access to the hotel buffet. And at the top of the pyramid, ever since the 70s, the party elite had been taking a cut of the smuggling and trading schemes, all of it undermined any efforts to improve production. The Soviet Union could not even make a pair of tights or shoes, said Shevets. Prostitutes would give themselves for one night for one stocking and then the next night for the other. It was a nightmare. It was the members of the security services foreign intelligence who saw most clearly that the system had to change. They're the ones who could travel and could see how the market economy operated in the West, how the socialist system was failing to keep up with the technological progress of the Western world. Among them was the legendary Soviet military intelligence chief Mikhail Milshinstein, a strapping Kojak bald man with thick, bushy eyebrows who'd served for decades in the U.S. and then returned to Moscow to head the intelligence department of the Soviet Military Academy. In the 70s, he moved to the Institute for the USA and Canada, a think tank that worked closely with Fallon's influential international department, where he was among those working on ways to engineer a rapprochement with the West. In the halls of the Institute, an elegant pre-revolutionary building tucked away down a narrow, leafy street behind Moscow's main thoroughfares, Milshinstein worked with other associates of the Soviet foreign intelligence elite on disarmament proposals. He forged close ties with the former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger as he sought ways out of what he called a vicious circle of the standoff with the West. Across town, deep in the southern suburbs of the city in a dark and sprawling 70s-era tower block, a group of economists at the Institute for World Economy and International Relations, known as IMEMO, began working on reforms that would start to relax the Soviet state's monopoly on the economy. Among them were a Rar Semisanian, a bright young economist in his early 30s, who was the son of a high-ranking Soviet military intelligence general. He worked closely with his deputy, Andrei Ekimov, a foreign intelligence operative who would later be sent to the head of the Soviet Union's bank in Vienna and subsequently became one of the most important financiers behind Vladimir Putin's regime. Simon Yane made research trips to East Germany, where he clearly saw how far behind the Soviet economy lagged. It was a different world, he said. Indeed it was. All right, so skipping on over here to pages 65 and 67 here. Under Andropov, a new generation of economists was being educated. The 20-something Yegor Gaidar discussed far-reaching market reforms that he believed were crucial to the survival of the Soviet bloc with the equally youthful Pyotr Avin. By the way, this Peter Avin guy, spelled Pyotr-Aven, would go on to become one of the big figures in the Alpha Bank, which would have a relationship with Far West Limited. So just keep that in mind, folks. But anyway, continuing with the book here. Both of them worked in another key research institute in the early 80s, the All-Soviet Institute for Systems Research, and both of them were from the heart of the Soviet elite. Avin's father had been one of the country's most respected academics, while Gaidar's had worked under cover of being a correspondent in Provadia in Cuba, where he rose to the rank of admiral. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara visited him in his home, and his son grew up surrounded by high-ranking Soviet generals. both Gaidar and Avon were to play leading roles in the market reforms of the new Russia. All the market reformers who later came to prominence, from Gorbachev to the young reformers, were brought up in the institutions created by Andropov, said Vladimir Yukinin, a close Putin ally from the KGB and later a senior Russian official. The first market reforms were mapped out at these institutions. Once Andropov had taken over as leader, progressive factions in the KGB, led by the Foreign Intelligence Directorate and the Economic Crime Directorate, began to experiment with the creation of a new class of entrepreneurs who would operate outside the confines of the Soviet-planned economy. They began with the black marketeers, the Chegosyovs. The real perestroika started under Andropov, said Christian Mikhail, a financial manager who, for more than a decade, handled funds for the Soviet and the Russian regimes. The message was given out to turn a blind eye to the black market. He knew the country was otherwise headed for mass starvation. There was a conscious creation of the black market, agreed Anton Surikov. Remember that name, guys. Anton Surikov, a former senior Russian military intelligence operative. It was impossible to work in the black market without the KGB connections and without protection from the KGB. Without them, no shadow business was possible, said Surikov. What had begun as corruption within the system became a KGB-cultivated petri dish for the future market economy, and a stopgap measure to fill the shortages of the command economy. The black marketeers were mostly from the Soviet Union's ethnic minorities. Often, they had very little choice, their careers having been blocked due to prejudices of the party elite. The only people who went into it were the people who had no prospects in the normal Soviet system, the ones who had hit a glass ceiling and could go no further, said Mikhail. These were the ethnic minorities, the Georgians, the Chechens, and the Jews. All right, so I'm going to stop with Putin's people there. So, few points here that I want to make. We're going to see a lot about how some of the ethnic minorities of the Soviet Union later turned up in very crucial roles in Far West Limited, and that's important to keep in mind. But another thing about this that I want to emphasize, this guy here that I just mentioned, this Anton Surikov, he was one of the founders of Far West Limited. And he was also one of the principal sources for this book that I just quoted from at length, Putin's People by Catherine Belton. This is one of the main works available in English that has explored Putin's Russia. And the Surikov guy was a big source for it. So as a result of this has a also very distinctly anti-Putin take. And again, this isn't to say that, there's not a lot of legitimacy to the claims that she makes. Again, Surikov was a very senior and well-connected figure in the Russian intelligence community, but he's doing this for propagandistic purposes, to create a specific narrative to be sold to the West through this very prestigious book, especially when they gained a lot of traction after the 2016 elections. And I just wanted to point that out because psychological warfare is a big part of this story. And this book, which I'm going to cite a couple more times, is a part of this psychological warfare narrative that Far West Limited has been crafting. Okay, guys? All right, so let's get back here to the state of the Soviet Union in the 80s and those glorious secret accounts. All right, so once Andropov's position was secure, he embarked upon a series of major reforms to the Soviet Union's economic system that would lay the foundation for perestroika under Gorbachev. Kryuchkov, Andropov's former deputy, realizing glasnost was not only inevitable but highly desirable, put a plan in motion to assure that key party officials, especially those tied to the national security state, would enjoy a soft landing while the rest of the Soviet economy was ravaged by the transition to capitalism. Kryuchkov set up over 600 companies in 1988 with links to the West. The principal purpose was to ensure the KGB remained a potent force after the transition to capitalism. These competing companies would operate on sound business principles while their profits would go towards funding future KGB operations. This involved integrating these security assets into the twin hearts of Western capitalism. That would be Wall Street and the City of London. These assets would learn the innermost workings of finance, the wellspring of Western capitalism. It was hoped that through these efforts, the Soviets would be able to destabilize the West from within. It's entirely possible these activities had the tactical approval of the Americans as well. During 1987, Khrushchev, as head of the KGB, found himself visiting the U.S. with Gorbachev. During this trip, he met with several high-ranking American figures in national security circles. They included Fritz Ermuth, a storied Soviet specialist then working on the National Security Council, and Colin Powell, then heading the NSC. That is the National Security Council, so to say. But the most intriguing guest was the then deputy director of the CIA, a post that was held by Robert Gates. Reportedly, Khrushchev told Mr. Gates to misrepresent the strength of the Russian state to his American counterparts while bemoaning that perestroika wasn't advancing quickly enough. Some have speculated that this was his way of telling Gates to speed up the process. Gates would meet with Khrushchev 2 additional times before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So keep this in mind, guys, as Gates appears as a major recurring figure in this saga. Okay, and also this meeting, the initial one occurred in 1987. It was 88 when a lot of these front companies were set up. And this kind of goes also into the broader U.S. Strategic blueprint by this point in time. I mean, a big part of why the Soviets were freaking out about their economy's ability to match U.S. military capabilities is that we had already started to telegraph our new strategy by the early 70s. And it really revolved around a figure, a technocrat named Stefan Pisani, big figure in the American Security Council and the World Anti-Communist League. And Pisani basically called for a massive U.S. spending spree in arms with the purpose of bankrupting the Soviet economy because he knew that they could not keep up financially with the rate that we could produce weapons. And this objective was pushed throughout the 70s by the so-called Team B. This was largely a group of ex-intelligence officers that began or I should say, ratcheted up the time-honored process of over-exaggerating Soviet military strength to create the illusion of a massive arms gap that we needed to counterbalance by a massive spending spree. And all of this went into effect during the 1980s when Reagan came into power, and also when a wave of terrorism was unleashed across the globe, much of it supported by the World Anti-Communist League in Latin America, in Southern Africa, and in Afghanistan that drew the Soviet Union into many of these spots militarily, and if nothing else, at least forced them to provide arms. So again, it's important to emphasize the role that Wackel was playing in all of this. They provided these sort of ideological plan for how we could bankrupt the Soviet Union on the one hand, and then they also were helping to organize a lot of the practical forces that could be used to erode the Soviet Union's hold in the developing world. And so again, Khrushchev and all these guys are aware of this. I mean, we weren't trying to hide this. Stefan Pisani was actively publishing these plans in foreign policy journals. I mean, the Soviets were surely reading them. This is, again, why they were freaking out. They saw a future in which the United States was going to massively ratchet up its arms spending and its support for quote-unquote freedom fighters. And there was just no way they were going to be able to bear the costs of keeping pace with this. Okay. So again, this makes this whole meeting here in 1987 so much more fascinating. Gates was not necessarily a part of these really far-right circles in WACL and the American Security Council, but Fritz Ermeth, another guy closely tied into the Far West story, was. So you got two guys here with Gates and Ermeth who would play big roles in Far West later on at this meeting as well. So again, all of this is really, really interesting. Do keep it in mind. But anyway, let us return to the intrigues playing out in Russia. So the best laid plans of mice and men, as they say. There was a major flaw in Krychkov's plan from the get-go, and that would be the man that he tapped to be his principal Western partner in these efforts. He was an Eastern European Jew turned British media mogul who went by the name of Robert Maxwell. Yes, that would be the same Captain Bob who sired Jeffrey Epstein's future Madam Ghislaine Maxwell. If tapping Maxwell to assist in this operation it wasn't enough, Krychkov further exasperated the issue via another man Maxwell was put into contact with to assist him in these endeavors. His name is generally given as Simeon Mogilevich. A Ukrainian Jew, Mogilevich has been described as the, quote, boss of boss behind various Russian mafias. The accuracy of this is highly debatable, but he may well be the most intelligent and sophisticated of the Russian mafia dons at a minimum. Being groomed by Maxwell no doubt helped with that. Mogilevich first made a name for himself by smuggling Russian Jews to Israel during the 1980s. So the pipeline of Russian Jews to Israel established by Maxwell and Mogilevich would later have profound implications for both countries. From the late 1980s through the 90s, in a span of a decade, roughly 1 million Russian Jews immigrated to Israel. Okay. By the late 1990s, they were estimated to be nearly 15% of Israel's total population. This is a huge dynamic in Israel's relation with Russia and vice versa, as we will explore in future installments. For now, though, we need to pause briefly and consider the motives of the West having laid out the position of the Russians. While Robert Maxwell is popularly depicted as an agent of the Israelis and the KGB primarily, with some American links as well, this misses one crucial component, the British one. Long before Captain Bob hooked up with any of these intelligence services, he belonged to the Crown. His relationship with the KGB was known by the British since literally its inception. Indeed, they're likely the ones who encouraged it. And this was really the basis of Maxwell's power. He was the UK's unofficial back channel to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This almost surely involved the transference of advanced weapons technology, as scientific espionage was long Maxwell's bread and butter. This is a subject that I deal with at length in a special relationship, which I urge you guys to check out for more information on this subject. All right. So just to pause here briefly, too, I want to point out is that the role the British played in all of this is often overlooked, but it is so incredibly crucial. I mean, if you really want to get down to it, the strategy that we are going to unfold over the course of this series is really one that the Crown has been working on for probably close to 200 years now. A lot of these groups, especially like a lot of these ethnic groups in Russia, were very closely cultivated by the Crown. This is especially true of the Ukrainians. British intelligence has been working with the Ukrainian Desiropa since I think at least the early 1930s, maybe as far back as the 1920s. They were actually the first significant Western backers of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, a group that you'll be hearing a lot about, specifically the Banderite faction, the good old UNB. They were big supporters of that, you know, again, all the way back in the 30s. And they also were a big supporter of a lot of these Islamic groups in Central Asia, as we will get into as well. So many of these networks have their origins with the UK. And in the case of Maxwell, this seems to be another interesting connection because he was very much uh, a part of this, disarray or this dysphoria of Jewish assets that have been used by the crown over the years as well. And again, the UK did play such a significant role in the creation of Israel in the first place, especially through the mechanisms of the Amri family, Julian and Leopold Amri. Again, it's another thing that I get into in the special relationship. So, but anyway, let us get back to Maxwell here. So, his dubious loyalties and all that, it made his assignment for this a bit curious in some senses. But in all likelihood, it was probably related to an ongoing operation that the British were running against Bulgaria. So Bulgaria is easily one of the most important nations in the Cold War struggle, at least back in the day. It probably still is, but certainly during the first one. It was also the first among the Soviet satellites to seriously open its economy to the West. And it all started during the mid-1960s with the establishment of two separate entities. One was the Koricom, a hard currency chain store established to sell luxury goods to tourists and Bulgarians. And this provided Bulgaria with an early means of acquiring Western hard currencies. Far more important, however, was the establishment of the arms manufacturing behemoth known as Kintex. It was granted a monopoly on exporting Bulgarian arms to foreign hotspots. So, Bulgaria has long enjoyed a rich history of smuggling, and Kintex opened the floodgates to this in the modern era. By the end of the 1970s, not only was Kintex smuggling arms to hotspots across the world, but also to peoples in exchange for drugs, arts, and antiques, all kinds of other stuff. This formed the basis for the highly controversial Bulgarian connection, which rose to prominence during the 1980s. Of course, there were the arms. Kintex would sell to anyone. They sold AK-47s and rocket-powered grenades to apartheid South Africa, who in turn dispatched weapons to UNITA proxies in Angola to be used against Cuban and pro-communist forces there. Keep all that in mind, by the way, because we'll be getting back to the UNITA Angola thing in a little bit. Anyway, this is an interesting case. Anyway, it's not an anomaly what they were doing there. The PLO could sell narcotics to the company in exchange for arms, and even the Contras in Nicaragua ended up with the arms from Kintex. It's likely the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were outfitted with weapons from Bulgaria to kill Soviet troops as well, paying them for them via heroin that was exported by enterprising Turks. 80% of the heroin used by Western Europeans was being smuggled through Bulgaria via Turkey on its way to Italy by the 1980s. On the Turkish end, and keep in mind Turkey was a NATO member even back then, a crucial partner was the DS, Bulgaria's version of the KGB, and on the Turkish side, another major partner were the Grey Wolves. And the Grey Wolves were a part of the Stay Behind network, a crucial one in Turkey. On the Italian end, the Mafia and Propaganda Due collected the drugs. So both the Grey Wolves and Propaganda Due, again, these are crucial nodes in NATO's stay-behind networks, commonly referred to as Gladio, but that was only the name of the Italian wing. And the Bulgarian connection, incidentally, also served as the basis for later claims that Lucio Gelli, P2's longtime Grandmaster, was the agent of the KGB. Was rather silly, in my opinion. To kind of illustrate this whole network appears to have still been functioning as recently as the 90s. One of the more famous or infamous P2 members was the Italian banker Roberto Calvia, who was found hanging dead from Blackfriars Bridge in London during the early 1980s. This came at a time when Banco Ambrosiano, which he headed, was emerging as a central piece in what was known as the Vatican banking scandal. And it was also going into collapse as well. The whole thing with this is really closely tied to a lot of intrigues with Italy at the time. St. Peter's Gate, which was the attempted assassination of John Paul II by a Turkish gunman supposedly trained by the Bulgarian security services, was also unfolding during this time. So anyway, Banco Ambrosiano collapses not long after Calvi's demise. It's broken up, it's sold off. One of the successors is known as Banco del Gottardo. So fast forward to the 90s. One of the guys seemingly tasked with setting up these KGB accounts is a former senior officer in said service named Felipe Turover. His father had been a senior figure in the Foreign Intelligence Services as well, and a well-connected one at that. Among his many powerful friends was Giulio Andreotti, the long-serving Italian prime minister and a former Propaganda Dewey member. Gosh, imagine that. Here's this Soviet poobah's father working with a P2 man. So Turover is tasked with setting up some of these accounts to hide the party and the KGB's funds that I've been talking about with Krichkov. One of the banks he ends up using is Banco del Gottardo. Among the accounts it oversaw in this capacity was one for an entity known as Mabitech, I think, spelled Mabetx, an obscure Swiss company that won billions of dollars in contracts throughout the 90s to renovate the Kremlin. Mabitech later played a crucial role in bringing down Boris Yeltsin after it was discovered that Mabitech had issued the family credit cards, which they in turn used to go on some epic spending sprees. Turover was the informant who brought Yeltsin down, paving the way for Putin's rise to power. So, yeah. But anyway, I'll get into some of these intrigues in a little bit. Let's get back to Bulgaria and Kintex here. So, the West appears to have gotten far more out of this arrangement. It acquired access to Soviet-style arms to equip various quote-unquote freedom fighters across the Soviet sphere. And after being drummed out of Eastern Asia, the Bulgarian connection paved the way for reestablishing the Western heroin trade. But there may have been an even more nefarious endgame at play on the part of the West. For this, we return to the UK during the 1970s, just as Kintex was being opened when Bulgaria turned into a smuggler's haven. At the time, several prominent Bulgarians were living in London. At the forefront was Lyudmila Shevkova, the metaphysically inclined daughter of the Bulgarian dictator Tudor Shevkov. Lyudmila was a major patron of the arts and culture in Bulgaria. She also had a keen interest in esotericism. At the forefront was her fascination with the Russian mystic Georgia Gurdjieff and Nicholas Roerich. Both men had likely done some spy work at some point in their lives, especially Roerich. By the 1940s, Roerich had entered into exclusive social circles in the U.S. These included, among others, then Vice President Henry Wallace. Interestingly, Lyudmila appears to have discovered Roerich later in her life when she was visiting India in 1975. There, she encountered Sviatoslav Roerich, Nicholas's son. 3 years later, she would declare 1978 the Roerich year. In celebration, a postage stamp of Roerich's image was taken from a portrait done by Sviatoslav and was used for the stamp. Lyudmila's real calling seems to have revolved around the pre-Bulgarian pagan culture of Thracian civilization, however. And it was a good choice. Ancient Thrace was a major cultural and political center. It was said to be the home of Orpheus, whose mysteries were revered throughout the ancient world. Democritus, a philosopher and mathematician who may have been the first to conceive of atomic theory, was also from Thrace. And so was Spartacus and multiple Roman emperors from between the 3rd and 5th century AD. And finally, when Constantine was looking for an eastern capital, he selected the Thrace to establish Constantinople at. So it was Lyudmila's interest in ancient Thracian civilization that sparked one of the most bizarre incidences to emerge from the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. Lyudmila had an interest in the alleged Bulgarian psychic and prophetess Baba Vanga. Vanga. And as the story goes, in 1981, she caught wind of these claims that Vanga had pointed to a mystical treasure residing in the Galiamo Gradišti region of Bulgaria. The site had long-standing mystical connections to ancient Thrace. As such, Ludmilla wasted no time in putting together a highly secretive team to investigate the site. But as the location resided within the borders of NATO member Turkey, the expedition was given support from the DS and the Bulgarian military. And the whole thing was rather later Raiders of the Lost Ark, with all these spies and commandos being used to head it. And it was cut short. The site ultimately was dynamited shut. A nearby spring overflowed and flooded the spot, creating a pool. Thus, the site was seemingly lost forever, and worse, authorities in Bulgaria began to investigate these events. At least one member of the team, Christo Mutachev, was imprisoned until the late 1980s. Now, keep him in mind as we shall return to him in these events. So, anyway, Ludmilla Shevakova was also known for a libertine lifestyle. At the forefront of her suspected lovers was the legendary Bulgarian novelist Georgy Markov. At one time, DSS said Markov defected to the UK in 1969. So during the early 1970s, Zyakova was also in the UK, staying at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. Her DS minder at the time was Christo Mutachev, who also became her lover during this time frame. And yes, Mutachev was the same guy she later took into Turkey for the dig at Galiamo Gradišti. But before all that, it was widely suspected that by the early 1970s, Markov, Mutachev, and even Zyakova had been turned by British intelligence. If so, this would have been a huge coup for the British and the West on the whole. Besides being Tudor Zyakov's daughter, Ludmilla was also widely viewed as his successor to Bulgaria's leadership. What this amounts to is this woman was being groomed to be the first female ruler of a Soviet satellite. If she had been turned by the West, this was huge on a number of levels. In other words, and there is ample reason to believe that this is the case based on how things played out. Markov was famously assassinated in the UK during 1978 via a Russian shot from an umbrella. Mutachev was arrested and imprisoned for smuggling Bulgarian artifacts during the early 1980s, as noted above. Ludmilla died suddenly in 1981 at the ripe old age of 39 from a sudden bout of brain cancer. At the time, again, bears repeating, she was the second most powerful figure in Bulgaria behind her father. And this is in the midst of this bizarre expedition to Galiamo Gradišti. And even the Bulgarian Minister of Minerals, another of the expedition's organizers, died suddenly during this time. This was another one of the things that led to the abrupt abandonment of the expedition. Adding further intrigue to these events were the activities of Ludmilla's legal husband, Ivan Slavkov, during this time. So Slavkov was the Director General of the Bulgarian Television Services, or BTS, meaning he basically controlled all of the programming in the country. At the same time, he was brokering the above-mentioned arms deal between Kintex and South Africa. Slavkov may even have been induced into this brokerage by an arms trafficker working with the South Africans who seduced him. This was actually a mother and wife duo that walked out of Austria with the daughter apparently doing some of the badger work. Anyway, the German newspaper Der Spiegel broke this story in 1980, eventually resulting in Slavkov's resignation from the BTS, the Bulgarian Television Service, in 1982. Gosh, guys, isn't 1982 keep coming up a lot, doesn't it? I wonder why. Anyway, it could be concluded from this series of events that, on the one hand, Ludmilla Zevakova was aware of Bulgaria's emerging role as Eastern Europe's principal smuggling hub, especially for arms. This seems reasonable as her husband was directly involved in it, a fact she surely would have been aware of by at least 1980 when the German press exposed him. But as the heir apparent to her father, it's likely she was abreast of these developments well before then. This adds an additional level of intrigue to the bizarre archaeological expedition she headed to Turkey shortly before her death. Afghanistan was beginning to replace the Golden Triangle as the world's primary supplier of illicit opium, the so-called Golden Crescent, and the main distribution route ran between Turkey and Bulgaria before being surrendered to the loving hands of the Sicilian mafia. Was the expedition then more concerned with the smuggling of heroin than ancient artifacts? Certainly never know, but it's highly suggestive that Ludmilla and so many people close to her either died during this period or were incarcerated or fell from grace. But the West need not have worried because because after Ludmilla, the number 3 in Bulgaria was Andrea Lukhanov, another DS operative, and reportedly KGB bosses Vladimir Krychkov's most trusted asset in the country. That's why Krychkov had set Lukhanov up with Robert Maxwell as his minder when they opted to do business with the media giant. The decision to open the Soviet sphere to Maxwell had been made by Lukhanov to be his point man. And it made perfect sense as Bulgaria was at the forefront of the efforts to open the Soviet bloc to Western capital, both legal and illicit. Maxwell, under Lukhanov's supervision, was given a special account at the Bank of Bulgaria. This account was to be used to set up Krychkov's hundreds of front companies on behalf of the KGB. It was also here that the illicit money the KGB generated from arms and drugs trafficking would be laundered. Semyon Moglievich used the Bulgarian Cooperative Bank to launder money through during these years as well. Maxwell eventually took that one over during the late 1980s. So let's pause now and consider the implications of all this. So it's my contention that by the late 1970s, at least, aware that the Soviets were increasingly dipping their toes into smuggling to prop up a failing economy, a decision was made. The West would enable the Soviet security services to take a seat at the vast table of funding generated by the criminal underground. Here they would find all the money they needed to prepare for the post-communist era. But more importantly, from the West point of view, it was here that they would be compromised and corrupted. The rigid discipline of the Soviet state, and especially within the security services, would be eroded through criminal activity. And this, in theory, would make them more compliant to Western wishes. Outlandish, you say? Well, consider the following. I'm getting this from a work entitled Ukraine in the Crossfire by Chris Casper D. Polig, I believe. Sorry if I'm getting that wrong, but is an excellent book, and the last name is D.E. space P-L-O-E-G. I definitely recommend it if you want some insight into the current conflict in Ukraine. But anyway, this addresses how the first President Bush reacted to the collapse of the Soviet Union circa 1980. Nevertheless, U.S. President Bush was not pleased and wished to seize what he saw as an opportunity to advance on the Soviets. To hell with that, he told the German chancellor. We prevailed and they didn't. We can't let the Soviets clutch victory from the jaws of defeat. As Bush sought to claim his Cold War victory, his aims suddenly became more feasible. The Soviet Union's economy was collapsing, and a strategy arose to, quote, bribe the Soviets out, end quote. West Germany was given 15 billion Deutschmarks to the Soviet government, and this is how, in essence, the limits on NATO expansion were both promised and later unpromised, not on the basis of morality, but due to power dynamics in the negotiating process. Sorete elaborates. This is a quote within the book from a report on this particular meeting, which was in 1990. In May 1990, Jack Matlock, the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, reported that Gorbachev was starting to look, quote, less like a man in control and more like an embattled leader, end quote. The, quote, signs of crisis, end quote, he wrote in his cable from Moscow, quote, are legion. Simple rising crime rates, proliferating anti-regime demonstrations, burgeoning separatist movements, deteriorating economic performance, and a slow, uncertain transfer of power from the party to the state and from the center to the periphery. End quote. Moscow would have a hard time addressing these domestic problems without the help of foreign aid and credit, which meant that it might be willing to compromise. The question was whether West Germany could provide such assistance in a manner that would allow Gorbachev to avoid looking as though he was being bribed into accepting a reunified Germany and NATO with no meaningful restrictions on the alliance's movement eastward. Kohl accomplished this difficult task in two bursts. It's Hermann Kohl, by the way, the German chancellor. First, in a bilateral meeting with Gorbachev in July 1990, and then in a set of emotional follow-up phone calls in September 1990. Gorbachev ultimately gave his assent to a united Germany and NATO in exchange for face-saving measures, such as a 4-year grace period for removing Soviet troops and some restrictions on both NATO troops and nuclear weapons on the former East German territory. He also received 12 billion Deutschmarks to construct housing for the withdrawing Soviet troops and another 3 billion in interest-free credit. What he did not receive were any formal guarantees against NATO expansion. Another MIT study by Joshua R. Itzkowitz Shifrinson suggests, however, that this chain of events does actually suggest an agreement with against NATO expansion. Although it is true that no formal guarantees were issued, this is fairly standard practice in international diplomacy, and especially so during the Cold War. For example, even the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved through an informal agreement. Shifrinson documents how American and West German officials quite consistently gave the impression that the deal against NATO expansion was actually on the table all the while until the final reunification of Germany. As such, the formal agreement that no non-German troops would be deployed in East Germany could be understood as a confirmation of such a broader informal understanding. Shifrinson shows, moreover, that U.S. policymakers were consciously deceitful, privately making plans for the U.S. and NATO dominance in the region while suggesting otherwise during the negotiations. Such deceit was no small matter. Then U.S. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft recognized that a reunified Germany within NATO would be, quote, the Soviet Union's worst nightmare and, quote, rip the heart out of the Soviet security system. U.S. assessments even considered the possibility that the Soviet Union would trigger a, quote, World War III scenario to prevent this outcome. As Gorbachev called during the negotiations, when you say that NATO would disintegrate without Germany, this also applies to the Warsaw Pact, end quote. All right, guys. So I also want to point out, I believe Khrushchev was present during this 1990 venture to the United States as well for these negotiations with Bush. And again, this is a crucial aspect in a lot of the intrigues currently playing out in regards to NATO expansion. And again, it's important to emphasize that we got the Soviets effectively to agree to dismantle the Soviet Union through bribery. This is more or less effectively what they're even acknowledging there. And again, these were funds that were almost surely not spent on building housing for returning Soviet troops, but were probably siphoned off to these mystery accounts, which is another reason why it would be intriguing if Khrushchev was a part of these endeavors. But anyway, let's get back here to Bulgaria. So anyway, who was better to manage all of this corruption than Robert Maxwell? He of dubious loyalty and atop a vast criminal empire stretching across several continents. Well, it's commonly believed that the KGB and the DS were behind Georgy Markov's assassination, as well as Zhukovia's sudden death and Mudachev's downfall. The role of British intelligence cannot be discounted in any of this either. Lyudmila Zivakova was many things, but few doubted her Bulgarian patriotism. And her strong spiritual bent, especially against an atheistic regime, greatly implies she had principles beyond money. Hence, the kind of wholesale corruption Bulgaria endured under future Prime Minister Lukhanov likely would not have happened on her watch. Thus, even if Zyakova and the circle around her were sometimes British assets, they surely would not have been willing to take things to their logical endgame in the fashion that Lukhanov did. When all was said and done, he and Maxwell were able to loot over $2 billion from Bulgaria alone into Western bank accounts. And certainly none of it ended up in the coffers of the Daily Mirror's pension fund, which Maxwell was also looting hundreds of millions of dollars from during this time. Indeed, very little of the money Maxwell acquired in these efforts has ever been recovered. Thus, the possibility that the British played a role in these events cannot be discounted, as their own banks profited immensely from these efforts, to say nothing of Maxwell's robust arms trade. But we've been another player in all this too that's important. And it involves good old Kroll Associates, the infamous private intelligence firm closely linked to 9/11 that has been described as a corporate CIA. Kroll Associates were hired by Captain Bob during early 1991 to guard his financial empire from various banks, then demanding repayment on the loans that he had taken from them. At roughly the same time, i.e. 1991, Kroll was hired by the Russian government to locate all the money that had been siphoned off by Khrushchev for his KGB front companies. Kroll was also later brought in to investigate blood diamonds in the Angolan conflict, which we will get to here in a second, and also the whole thing with 9/11. Needless to say, none of these investigations turned up much. So Kroll seems to be a major player in all this as a whitewash instrument. And again, another significant player in the whole private intelligence, private military field, though obviously they're much more in the former.